I want to ask you about the resistance, is what we'll call them, or Khummus, for the sake of the algorithm, so the video is not demonetized or deplatformed. Given the current situation, what really were they expecting to take place? Did they think that they could capture these hostages and that Israel would actually negotiate with them in good faith for the lives of the soldiers and the civilians captured? Or have they been completely blindsided and surprised by the extent of the ruthlessness of the Israeli government and their Hannibal directive policy to murder their own people?
I think that when it comes to hummus, I think that first of all, it's important to remember the context of the previous question to understand why October 7th happened. There is a suggestion somehow that how did they not expect that this would be the response? But if you acknowledge that Israel was preparing to invade the Jenin refugee camp and the West Bank, the point is war was coming irrespective. October 7th just happened to be, call it whatever you want, a preemptive strike or the like. But the notion that it came out of nowhere is something that is denied now even by EU officials and the like. Like everybody's aware that there is a context to what happened. Again, it's not about justifying all the like. It's about providing analysis of what actually happened. The idea that, there's all this normalization taking place. Erdogan is shaking hands with Netanyahu. Bin Salman is getting ready to normalize. He's doing interview Fox News and saying we're getting closer every single day. And Netanyahu understanding from all this normalization that now's the time to invade Jenin refugee camp. My point is war was coming. Netanyahu was about to prepare in the West Bank, and one of the theories why there was no Gaza defense force when October 7th happened is because there are reports that Netanyahu had moved those units towards the West Bank in preparation for an invasion of the West Bank itself. So I think that's the first point. When we look at it, could they not have predicted it? That question presupposes that the status quo was sustainable, when in reality the status quo was reaching fever pitch after Netanyahu was receiving all these assurances that he could do what he wanted with impunity. The second thing that's worth noting is that when you look at, for example, the Khummus and how they are able to continue firing rockets at the Israelis, I think Kissinger had a really interesting statement where he said the issue with fighting guerrilla forces is that a conventional army loses if it does not win, whereas a guerrilla force wins so long as it does not lose. And I think Ghassan Abu Sitta, I saw a podcast of him, I think he was talking to Thinking Muslim or somebody else. I think Ghassan Abu Sitta made a statement where he said that we win by surviving, we win just by existing. And I think that's very much what is frustrating the Israelis, because you think about it this way: Israel objectively has absolutely decimated Gaza. We're talking almost 30,000 killed, we're talking 10,000 children, we're talking mainly women, civilians, or we're talking about a genuine decimation of Gaza. But when you read the news, you don't get the sense that the Israelis are on the verge of any sort of victory, whether it's military or whether it's even like a moral or whether it's even a PR victory. On the contrary, the more Israel seems to be bombarding Gaza, the worse this image seems to be getting. Think about it. Israel militarily on the ground is decimating Gaza. But the ICJ ruling has said that Israel now has to stand trial for genocide. Biden was unable to get the case kicked out. 15 judges to 2 ruled that Israel should stand trial for genocide, and now that's moving ahead. Macron says it's unsustainable, we need a ceasefire, and he called for a ceasefire before even asking Biden to do so, separated from Biden. The deputy prime minister of Belgium is saying now Belgium is saying we need to put sanctions on Israel. Joseph Borrell, the foreign policy chief of the European Union, is talking about consequences on Israel because they reject a two-state solution. These aren't the positions of allies who believe Israel is winning. These aren't the positions of allies who believe that Israel is gaining from what it's doing in Gaza. And that's the point that I want to emphasize here, in that when we look at, for example, Khummus and what they're doing, they're aware that as long as they survive, even today, before on the day that we're recording, I saw news that Khummus are conducting operations in the northern areas where the Israelis have insisted that they have full control, suggesting that every time they pull back, it's like whack-a-mole, like they just pop up and there are all these videos, and not only that, you see testimonies of Israeli soldiers going back to Israel and saying, Israel is not telling you the full truth of what's happening. Like we're getting kicked here by people in Adidas, tracksuits and slippers that are just coming up and firing and the like. And I think it's less to do with the idea. I think the wording of the question might be changed a little bit because the wording of the question suggests that the resistance is making gains or the like, whereas in reality it's hard to look at what's happening and say the resistance is winning. I think it's more accurate to say that in this war, Israel has done so much damage to its image that even if it wins a military victory, in the long term, it won't actually count for much because they lose more on the international stage in terms of its legitimacy, its interaction with its allies, the shift in public opinion. We're seeing it here in America. We're seeing under 35s now they are no longer, supporting the Israelis. When they asked TikTok, they said, please limit the reach of these pro-Palestinian content. The TikTok chiefs, they said, listen, we'll show you the data. It's not the algorithm. It's just the new generation is pro-Palestinian. Kamala Harris's daughter, I heard she's raising money for Palestine as well, showing you in the same household there is this generational shift. And that suggests that the next generation will not be as ideologically inclined towards Zionism in the way that we see today. And that's why sometimes I think that if Israel one day, when it reflects, or Netanyahu, or indeed Benny Gantz, or Yair Lapid, I think if they were offered a choice to go back and choose to maintain the monopoly over the narrative or decimate Gaza, they would choose to preserve their monopoly over the narrative that's been emphatically broken at this time. It's also worth noting that even domestically, when you look at Ehud Olmert, the former Israeli prime minister, or you look at, Yair Lapid, or you look at some of these other Israeli politicians who are in favor of the ground offensive but turning against Netanyahu and openly saying that there is no strategic victory for us here. There's no, even Lloyd Austin, he said, the civilian casualties means that you may win I can't remember the exact phrase, it was like you may win a tactical victory but not a strategic victory, or something along those lines, saying, this short-term gain you're getting won't benefit you in the long term. And I think that's the point. As long as Hamas continue to, pop their heads out, it makes the Israelis even more difficult. It makes it difficult for the Israelis to assert any sort of victory, which is why I think that one of the reasons we haven't seen a ceasefire yet is because although Blinken and Biden are now more inclined towards a ceasefire, Biden is worried about the elections. He's looking for any masjid in Michigan that will receive him, looking for any Muslims who will sit with him so he can take a photo where he can, sort of show himself listening to them. There are still, but the point is that I think it's less that Biden and Blinken are now averse to a ceasefire. I think they're certainly pushing for one in their own way, but I think they're struggling to find a way out for the Israelis in a manner that allows them to claim that the Israelis won. And that's why they keep talking about the day after Gaza, in this idea of trying to impose the Palestinian Authority on Gaza. The final point worth mentioning is actually this. A couple of weeks ago, maybe 10 days ago, mine's a bit of a blur with all the traveling, but Netanyahu made a statement which was interesting. In the statement that he said that we don't recognize a two-state solution, or we won't accept a two-state solution, contradicting Biden, who had to make excuses, no, that's not what he meant. But Netanyahu was humiliating Biden in this regard. Netanyahu also made another statement in which he said now is not the right time to hold elections. And I think that was a response to Blinken, because Blinken, when he went to Tel Aviv last time, met with Yair Lapid, and he met with Benny Gantz, and he met with some of the oppositions. And it was said he did that without consulting Netanyahu, suggesting he was trying to get them to push for elections so they could get Netanyahu out of the picture and then orchestrate a way out for Israel where it looks like they won. Even now we're looking at the ceasefire deal. Hamas have said that they will reject the deal because although they agree on the hostage release and hostage exchanges, I think it's female hostages for 1 month and the males for 1 month, Netanyahu is so concerned that this will be considered a defeat that he wants to insist on being allowed to continue the military offensive after, the truce ends. And I think that's revealing in and of itself that Netanyahu finds himself in a position that for all of the Palestinians he's killed, for all of the buildings he's destroyed, for all of the hospitals that he bombed, he doesn't feel like he's anywhere closer to rescuing his political future. He still believes if the war ends now, the Israelis will force him out of office. And I think that says everything you need to know about the resistance, about Hamas, in that they have nowhere else to go. They have nothing to lose. The Palestinians have nothing to lose. Each more land gets taken each time. Or for them, it's an idea. You squeeze them. And I think even when we look at, the events of October 7, I always say, and I say this to some friends of mine, non-Muslim friends, people who are just learning about Palestine, Israel, they say, yeah, there was a party taking place, and the party was attacked. But think about it this way. How desensitized do you have to be to the Palestine-Israel issue that a party or a rave at the walls of the world's biggest open-air prison, that a party at the walls of what can only be described as a concentration camp, concentration of civilians in one place, it's just considered normal that you can just say the sentence, there was a party at the walls of the concentration, and you say it without any oh wait a minute, that's insane, like Germans they're having a rave, next to, the concentration camps where they used to put the Jews in or the like. I know some people don't like the comparisons but in reality we're looking at the same. It's a persecution of a people by virtue of what they look like and who they believe, the same way that the Nazi Germany persecuted the Jews. And that's why I think that to answer this question very simply, I think that for all the destruction that we've seen, I think it's very telling that the Israelis are yet to come up with a narrative that suggests they're winning, while the Palestinians are very easily coming up with narratives to suggest that they are the ones in fact winning. The Palestinians are saying, public opinion has shifted, Israel is under pressure, now it's a genocide regime, the ICJ, South Africa, global South versus global North, and all the Europeans. The Palestinians can point to things and say, you know what, a genocide is taking place, but the world is starting to hear us now. And I think that's why the Israelis are panicking and trying to spend millions to get, TikTokers and influencers to push back against videos like this. I think that it's very difficult to predict the future or what happens. And the reason why I say this is that if you look at history, take the Algerian liberation, for example, of France. We had two main movements. We had Masali al-Hajj and we had Farhat Abbas, and they were the dominant trends, in the fight against the French or the like. But the group that liberated Algeria ended up being the Front Libération Nationale, the FLN, that popped up in 1954, rendered the other two obsolete, and then ended up delivering the independence. Not to say the other two didn't have a role, but that was the final stage that happened. In other words, it may well be next 5-10 years we don't have any Khummus and we don't have Palestinian Authority. It may be like a new movement. I think that in terms of short term, I think what we're seeing is a move not necessarily towards a ceasefire, but a phasing out of the conflict, phasing out in stages, releasing the hostages, keeping a state of war in terms of name, while in substance, no war. Very similar to what we saw in Yemen, where the Houthis and the Saudis didn't have an official ceasefire because they didn't renew it, but there was no real fighting taking place in those 2 years when they were negotiating. The reason the Saudis didn't want to sign the ceasefire is because they felt it would acknowledge the legitimacy of the Houthis, which they later on ended up acknowledging anyway by sending their ambassador. But the point is that it may work. They're trying to find a solution whereby they can tone down the war or reduce or phase out the fighting, to buy time for Biden to convince the Muslims that in Michigan and these other 6 swing states, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Florida somebody told me Florida might be one of them, but I'm not entirely sure. But in any case, to give Biden time until November to convince the Muslims that although he committed a genocide, Trump is going to be worse, and therefore they should forgive the genocide and go vote for Biden. I think there will be a phasing out of the fighting, primarily because Biden wants a solution in which he can claim that he supported the Israelis so he can have the Zionist bloc on board, without saying that he allowed Hamas to continue, or Hamas to continue ruling Gaza. The idea being that this is why when you read all the news, at least today, before I entered, it's all about how do we get the Palestinian Authority back into Gaza. All these policymakers are saying we need a ceasefire, but we need to think how to get the Palestinian Authority back in Gaza to make sure that the Hamas can't say that they survived it and they're still in Gaza and they're still ruling Gaza as well. How they achieve that, I don't know at all, to be honest. There's also the other angle in that, although everybody else is talking about a ceasefire and the Israeli allies are trying to pressure them for a ceasefire, the Israelis do appear to be pressing forward. They're trying to go to the Rafah crossing. They're trying to take over, that border from the Egyptians as well. There is this sort of, this is a golden opportunity to annex Gaza. This is a golden opportunity to ethnically cleanse it. This is a golden opportunity that might not come again, whereby we can kick out the entire population and take this land and attach it to this holy land of Judea, or whatever they call it, and the point. And I think that in many ways is trumping the pressure to push for a ceasefire, and why Netanyahu is also resisting it as well. So although it looks like we're getting closer to a ceasefire, the closer we get to a ceasefire is also, we're also seeing an increased ferociousness of the assault on Gaza itself. But to answer your question simply, I think it won't necessarily be a ceasefire, although it could be. I mean, no one knows the future, but it could be a ceasefire. But I think that as it stands, it's more likely to be a phasing out of the fighting that allows room to make sure they don't recognize Hummus in Gaza, and allows a state of war where there's no fighting, but there are negotiations to bring amenable Palestinian parties to rule over Gaza itself. Having said that, there's also the other alternative, which is that when you look at the provocations that are taking place in the West Bank, remember, there's fighting in Gaza and genocide in Gaza. There's also flare-ups and a lot of fight taking place in the West Bank as Israel tries to take advantage to go into the West Bank itself. There could be another intifada. You never know. I mean, it's when you squeeze a population so much and you don't give them recourse, what ends up happening is you end up having this explosion, lashing out as well. So in reality, I'm not entirely sure what happens next, primarily because it does appear that there's still a push to provide an environment of impunity for the Israelis. And although Biden is concerned about the elections in November, Biden is receiving assurances from certain Muslim groups in America and Muslim leaders in the region that Muslims will not punish him in November. And I know that sounds extraordinary, but I saw a tweet from an American Muslim who said that Biden still has a chance to win back the Muslim vote if he shows empathy and understanding about their feelings, that even after genocide 30,000, this American Muslim believes there's still hope to vote for Biden, because a man who committed genocide is better than a man who might commit genocide. Biden might be better than Trump. I'm not endorsing Trump in any way whatsoever. I'm saying that Biden, on the one hand, is reading in the paper that the Muslim vote intends to punish him, but he's being told by Muslim leaders and some Muslims in America that we won't punish you because we're so scared of Trump that we're willing to let go of the genocide. And I actually think that's one of the reasons why Biden, before he calls for a ceasefire, is testing the waters first domestically, sending his campaign manager to Michigan. Can we find people to meet us? Can we find masajid to meet us? Can we find these people to sit with us? And if he can find them, he will say, you know what? The Muslims are not a united bloc. They're divided. I think I can win enough of them in November. I don't need to call for a ceasefire. Let me expand this window and allow them to commit genocide further. Having said that, I do think the window of genocide is closing. It's abundantly clear there's this unprecedented shift taking place in terms of how people are approaching the Israelis, and it does appear that Netanyahu now appears to be the sole man standing in the way of a ceasefire, because he fears that if he ends the fighting now, he will be kicked out of power, and that Biden wants to see him out, Erdogan wants to see him out, France wants to see him out, Benny Gantz wants to see him out, Yair Lapid wants to see him out, the families of hostages want to see him out, the protesters in Tel Aviv want to see him out, they all want to see Netanyahu out. And I think it's more about how do we market this in a way that won't allow your podcast to say that the Israelis lost. And I think they haven't come up with that scenario. And given that, there's still, they believe there's still hope to mitigate the worst of the consequences, let's see how long it goes. Having said that, ceasefire talks are still ongoing, so you never know what will happen.
Trust nothing. No